Hello, in this video we will be addressing Learning Target 14. I can label the water cycle correctly using the following words: condensation, precipitation, sublimation, evaporation, and transpiration. And we're focusing on the standard 2-3, develop a model to describe the cycling of matter and flow of energy among living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. Alright, so in the past week we have been talking about energy. You all know that all living things need energy to survive, and all the energy comes from the sun. And we also learned about how when we move up the energy pyramid, energy is being used up and lost as heat, and some of it, 10%, gets passed on to each level. Okay, so this is review. Now, we're going to talk about something new. We have energy, and then we have matter. Matter is also another part of an ecosystem that is really important. So what is matter? So all living things need matter to survive, and matter is a fancy word for all the material that makes all living things. Matter is atoms and molecules. So these are some examples of matter. Maybe you have heard of the idea of states of matter, solid, liquid, and gas, and maybe you have experience with when you add heat to matter, it changes forms, like solid becomes a liquid, which becomes a gas. Now, matter is a little different from energy because it doesn't really get lost. So we talked about energy being used up and escaping into the atmosphere. But with matter, that doesn't necessarily happen. What happens with matter is that it gets recycled, which is a little different from being used up. So this picture represents how matter, so for example, oxygen and carbon dioxide, that's matter. It's made out of atoms. Those things actually get recycled among all the living things within the ecosystem, okay? And down here we have a list of different types of matter. So these are elements that are necessary for living things to survive, okay? Now let's talk about one type of matter that's really, really important to all living things. This is water. We have this cycle in our world called the water cycle. And basically what it is, it's the way that water gets recycled throughout different ecosystems so that all living things will have access to this water, okay? And this is a picture of the water cycle. You're going to have to know each part of the water cycle and understand and tell me how water gets recycled through different forces, okay? Now, let's talk about the 3 different ways that water moves from the ecosystem into the atmosphere. The first way is evaporation, and maybe you have heard of this word before, but evaporation is when heat from the sun's energy actually hits the surface of the water right here, and because the sun adds heat, some of the water molecules escape from this body of water and goes into the atmosphere. The second way that water goes into the atmosphere is called sublimation. Sublimation usually occurs in very high altitudes and mountains, and here's a picture. It's when snow and ice directly becomes water vapor and goes into the atmosphere. So you see these cloud looking things right here. It's actually water vapor from the snow that's going into the atmosphere because the sun is hitting that snow and causing some of those water molecules to escape into the atmosphere. The third way is transpiration. Transpiration occurs in plants and trees, and it's when water escapes through the leaves. And I think you can remember when we made our foldable, I had you draw these little openings. They're called stomata. Stomata are usually found on the underside of a leaf, and they're little openings that allow air to pass in and out. And through these stomata, sometimes water vapor gets lost, and so that water vapor actually goes back into the atmosphere. Now let's talk about how water comes back down from the atmosphere back onto ecosystems. There's 2 processes involved. First, there's a process called condensation. Condensation is when the water vapor cools down. So it usually happens in clouds like this. And when the water condenses and cools, tiny little water droplets will form and it will precipitate. And the second way, it's called precipitation. Precipitation is when there is water falling from the sky. It's usually rain, hail, or snow. Now let's talk about one more part of the water cycle. And let's talk about what happens after the precipitation. So after the rain falls back down on the ecosystems, where does it actually go? Well, some of it goes into the ocean, and before it goes into the ocean, it falls through rivers and lakes, and which empties into the ocean. And I think you can see a picture of that here. It will fall through rivers and lakes, go back into the ocean. Some of it actually will be runoff, and runoff is actually a word that represents precipitation that falls on the land, and it flows off the surface of the ground, and that water will pick up things from the land and dump into bodies of water such as a lake. Runoff is sometimes a big problem in cities because in cities when we have lots of chemicals and unnatural things on the concrete, and when it rains it will drain all those chemicals back into bodies of water, and which will affect living things. So we're going to talk a little bit more about runoff and pollution in another lesson, but just keep that in mind. Groundwater is when some of the water from the land will sink into the ground and it gets stored underneath the ground and forms a body of water called groundwater. So those are the three places where precipitation goes. And the cycle will start all over again because from the ocean, some of the water will evaporate, form clouds, it will precipitate. So this is the water cycle that keeps the water going around. Now, let's test your knowledge and see how well you understand these words and the concepts. So at this time, you're going to log into Blundspace for the LT14 Level 2 quiz. Remember that a passing score is at least 4 out of 5. And if you get a 4 or a 5 or higher, 4 out of 5 or higher, mark an X in the Level 2 column on your grade tracker. If you didn't, mark yourself as a Level 1. And then you're going to retake the quiz. Okay, and that's it.